Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to replace the valve cover gaskets and the PCV valve on a 2004 Lexus GS 300. The process is exactly the same for a variety of Toyota and Lexus models with a 2JZ-GE engine, either VVTI or non-VVTI. For a full list of the compatible vehicle models, have a look at the video description below. Replacing the valve cover gaskets is pretty straightforward, but their location under the throttle body means that there is a considerable amount of labor required to get to them. Consequently, most shops are going to charge you around $400 to $500 to replace them. By watching this video and following along, you can do it yourself and save a good amount of money. On these cars, since the spark plugs are located in the valley in between the intake and the exhaust valve covers, it is important to replace the valve cover gaskets because if they leak, they're going to dump oil into the spark plug holes and you're going to get misfires. You can find a list of all the parts and the tools I used in this video in the video description below. So let's get started. The two valve cover gaskets we'll be replacing in this video are located underneath the intake manifold, which in turn is located underneath this engine cover. Remove the four 10mm bolts holding in the engine cover and set the cover aside. Next, we'll loosen the two clamps holding the pipe that goes from the air cleaner assembly into the intake. Use the screwdriver with a Phillips head bit to do this. The exhaust side valve cover is connected to the intake through this breather hose, so we need to remove this as well. These hoses can be on pretty tight due to their close proximity to the engine and the heat it generates, so definitely be prepared for some tugging. Now you can remove the air intake pipe and set it aside. Remove the throttle control motor connector by pushing on the tab and pulling on the connector. And similarly disconnect the throttle position sensor connector. Remove this 10mm bolt holding the wiring harness to the throttle body. And then disconnect the accelerator pedal position sensor. Remove the accelerator cable by turning the spool and pushing the locking pin out through the space provided as shown. Loosen either one of them by using the open side of a wrench and then set the cable free. Next, we will remove the hose going from the PCV valve to the intake. Slide the clamp off and then slide the hose off. Follow the same process for the air assist to intake hose, which is located diagonally below the PCV valve hose. To finish off the removal of vacuum hoses, remove this vacuum hose which is located right next to the PCV valve hose. Towards the back of the intake air plenum, there is another 10mm bolt that holds in the VSV connector bracket that you need to remove. Finally, loosen the clamp and remove the coolant bypass hose that goes into the throttle body. Remember to slide a paper towel underneath before you do this, as a little bit of coolant will leak out. The air intake is held to the plenum using 4 bolts on the top and 2 nuts on the bottom as shown. All 6 fasteners are 12mm in size. The top 4 bolts are pretty easy to reach, but the bottom 2 nuts are pretty tight and you may need a smaller wrench to reach them. Finally, remove these two 12mm bolts holding the throttle body plate to the engine. Now you should be able to slide the throttle body assembly off of the intake plenum studs and set it to the side as shown. To give us complete access to the valve covers, we'll need to remove this timing cover. Remove the 4 5mm hex bolts holding the cover in and set it to the side. Remove the 3 electrical connectors by either yanking them out with pliers or by bending in the plastic tab to release them, depending on how intact they are. Then remove the 2 wires from the little bracket holding them in and set the entire wiring harness aside. It is not necessary to remove the coil plug wires in order to access the valve covers. If you do decide to go ahead and remove them, make sure to take a picture of how the coil packs and the boots are arranged so that you can match it up when you put everything back together. Remove this clip holding the wiring harness down by pushing upwards on the tab. This will give the wiring harness some slack. Clean off the wiring harness with a wet cloth, followed by the heater hose at the back to make sure that no dust or debris gets inside the valvetrain when we take the valve covers off. As you can see, if you look from the front of the engine, the intake valve cover is located on the right hand side and the exhaust valve cover on the left. The valve covers are attached to the head by 8 fasteners each, 6 bolts and 2 nuts. Before we open up the valve covers, give them a final clean off to remove any remaining dust or debris. You can use a wet cloth for this as well. We'll remove the exhaust side valve cover first. Break open the 8 fasteners with a 10mm socket. Remove the 8 fasteners and set them aside. It's a good idea to store them in a plastic baggie to make sure that they don't get lost. Before we proceed, it's helpful to pull the heater hose away from the valve cover by using a zip tie as shown. This will give us enough clearance to pull the valve cover off. Depending on the age of the engine and when the service was last performed, it is highly likely that the old valve covers are glued onto the head. Lightly tap a rubber mallet against the valve cover on various spots to set it free from the head. Do not use a steel or an iron hammer as this will dent the valve cover. As you can see, my valve cover was pretty stubborn and I had to use a combination of rubber mallet and a plastic pry tool to get it off. If the cover still does not want to come off, keep tapping on various spots with a rubber mallet. Eventually you should be able to pull upwards on the valve cover until it separates from the head with a squelch like this. Now you should easily be able to separate the rest of the valve cover from the cylinder head. Since the wiring harness is kind of in the way, you'll have to wiggle it around a bit in order to get the valve cover off, as you can see. Set the valve cover gently aside. Repeat the same process for getting the intake valve cover off. First, break the 8 fasteners loose. Remove them and set them aside in a Ziploc baggie so you don't lose them. And then tap on it with a rubber mallet just like last time to remove it. As you can see, this one was much easier than the exhaust valve cover. Now that the valve covers are off, the valve train is completely open. Be very careful not to drop anything inside as it will be very difficult to fish out. Now is also a good time to inspect the condition of the valve train. As you can see, the valve train is very clean and there is no sludge buildup as the engine underwent regular oil changes. Now we can go ahead and clean off the valve covers and then install the new gaskets. We'll start off with the exhaust valve cover. Remove the old gasket by pulling upwards. It should come off pretty easily like this. In case the gaskets haven't been changed in a while, they may be really brittle and break off while you remove them. In any case, make sure to completely remove all remnants of the old gasket from the valve covers. Spray the insides of the valve cover with engine degreaser and then use an old toothbrush to scrape it clean. Once you're done cleaning it, spray down the insides with water as shown. To make sure that the valve cover doesn't retain most of the water, angle it downwards while spraying it. Place the now clean valve cover in direct sunlight so that all the water evaporates from it. Now we can move on to the intake valve cover. Just like before, first remove the old gasket from the valve cover. The intake valve cover has the PCV valve attached, which we need to remove before we spray it down. Slide the clamps upwards and then remove the hose off of the PCV valve. To remove the PCV valve itself, you'll need a crowfoot socket as shown. It's on pretty tight, so you'll probably need a breaker bar to get it loose. Remove the PCV valve and set it aside. Now repeat the same process as last time to clean off the intake valve cover. First, spray the inside with engine degreaser. Clean it up with an old toothbrush. Spray the insides with water while angling the valve cover downwards. And then place it in direct sunlight to dry it off. Don't forget about the oil filler cap as well. Once the valve covers are completely dry, we can go ahead and install the new gaskets. Before we do this, we'll need to clean the valve cover area where the gasket sits so that a good seal is obtained. To do this, spray some brake cleaner on a paper towel. Use this to clean off the gasket seating area as shown. Don't forget to clean the half moon area in the front as well. Repeat the same process for the other surface the gasket seals against, which is the cylinder head. As you can see, the paper towel and brake cleaner combo cleans up pretty well. Remember to pull up on the wiring harness to give some space so you can clean up the half moon area as well. Once both the surfaces are clean, it's time to install the new gasket. As you can see, the valve cover has a groove where the gasket is supposed to go. Align the gasket with this groove and then press it so that it stays in place. Make sure that the gasket is completely seated in the valve cover all around and that there are no kinks or bumps. Before we actually place the valve cover on the cylinder head, we'll need to apply a little bit of RTV on the cylinder head at the areas as shown. Since there is a curve at this part, the RTV helps to get a good seal in between the valve cover and the cylinder head. As we're installing the valve cover gaskets one by one, only apply RTV to the exhaust side of the cylinder head for now. You don't need to apply a lot of RTV, just make sure that you can't see any metal at the corner, which means you got good coverage. This gives you a good idea of how it should look. Now slowly place the valve cover on the cylinder head as shown. There are two dowel pins, one at the back and one at the front, onto which the valve cover slides. While tightening down the 6 bolts and the 2 nuts, you'll have to go from inward to outward. This makes sure that the valve cover gasket makes a nice even seal in between the cylinder head and the valve cover. First, without a wrench, just snug them down until you can't turn them any further. Now tighten them using a wrench until they are snug again. Now we can go ahead and torque them to spec. The torque spec for the valve cover bolts and nuts is 75 inch-pounds. Don't forget to go from inward to outward again. This completes the installation for the exhaust side valve cover gasket. The process for the intake valve cover gasket is exactly the same. First, clean off the cylinder head with the paper towel and brake cleaner combo. Again, don't forget to clean off the little half moon area underneath the wiring harness. Press the new gasket into the valve cover and make sure it is seated properly in the groove. Next, apply a little bit of RTV at the corners of the half moon area as shown. Install the valve cover onto the 2 dowel pins. And don't forget about the oil filler cap. Just like the exhaust side valve cover, tighten the bolts and nuts from inward to outward. The torque specs for these 8 fasteners is also the same, 75 inch-pounds. Now we can go ahead and connect the electrical connectors to the coil packs. Just push them in until they click into place. This completes the replacement of the 2 valve cover gaskets, and now we can start putting everything back together and also install a new PCV valve. Tilt the throttle body assembly back down and then slide it onto the plenum studs. Hand tighten the 4 bolts and the 2 nuts holding the throttle body assembly to the plenum. This will secure it in place while we reconnect all the electrical connectors and hoses. Reinstall the coolant bypass hose and don't forget to put the clamp on using a pair of pliers. Reinstall the throttle position sensor connector, followed by the air assist to intake hose along with its clamp. Reinstall this vacuum hose on the back of the throttle body assembly, followed by the 10mm bolt holding the VSV electrical connector bracket. Slide the accelerator cable back into its bracket and use the 2 40mm adjusting nuts to tighten it into place. Pull the spool back as shown and then slide the accelerator cable pin in to secure it. As you can see, there is a little bit of slack in the accelerator cable. You can adjust this and make it more tight using the 2 40mm adjusting nuts. Unscrew the 2 nuts to loosen the cable from the bracket and then pull on the cable to make it tight. Once the cable is tight enough, tighten the nuts back down to secure it into the bracket. Install the throttle motor control connector on the front of the throttle body assembly, followed by the accelerator pedal position sensor on the back. Now we can tighten down the 4 bolts and the 2 nuts holding the throttle body assembly to the plenum. Don't forget these 2 nuts holding the throttle body plate to the engine. Reinstall the timing cover and tighten down the 4 5mm hex bolts. Now we can install the air pipe going from the air cleaner assembly into the throttle body. The pipe compresses like an accordion, so use this to wiggle it into place. Slide on the air pipe going from the exhaust valve cover to the air pipe along with its clamp. Tighten down the 2 worm clamps securing the air pipe by using a Phillips head screwdriver bit. Don't forget this 10mm bolt holding the wiring harness to the engine. I probably should have done this before installing the air pipe. Finally, reinstall the hose going from the PCV valve to the throttle body assembly along with its clamp. Thread the PCV valve into the intake valve cover by turning it clockwise. Turn it until you can see the pink sealant compress and it feels pretty snug. Now you can go ahead and tighten it down further with a crowfoot socket as shown. You don't need to tighten it down too much, just 1 turn is sufficient. If it's tightened too much, the valve cover may crack or bend as it is only made of aluminum. Push the other end of the hose back onto the PCV valve and then slide the clamp over the end to secure it in place. Now we can go ahead and reconnect the negative terminal of the battery and tighten it down using a 10mm socket. Before we start the engine up, it's good to give the engine bay a quick once-over just to make sure all sensors and hoses have been reconnected properly. Once you're done with that, it's time to start the engine up. All you have to do really is just make sure that the idle is smooth and there aren't any weird noises coming from the engine bay. Look under the throttle body assembly where we disconnected the coolant bypass hose just to make sure that the connection is tight and there is no coolant leaking out. You can use the accelerator cable spool to give the engine a few revs and make sure everything sounds smooth. It's also useful to get inside the car and see if any check engine lights pop up. Once you're satisfied everything looks good, turn the car off and then install the main engine cover. Tighten the 4 10mm nuts holding it down and we are good to go. So that brings us to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more of my content, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.